The sky above the prairie was painted with strokes of ash and ember, heavy with clouds that hung like curtains of soot. The wind was dry, spiteful. It carried the scent of scorched grass and old regret, tugging at the edges of an abandoned fence line that hadn't been mended in years. Dust rose in small clouds wherever boots had once tread but no longer did. The land stretched out in every direction, flat, barren, and bleached gold by years of merciless sun. This was a country for ghosts and men who had nothing left to lose. Thomas Rourke sat on the porch of his weathered ranch house, a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey resting by his boot. His eyes scanned the open fields like a man waiting for trouble or deliverance. He couldn't tell which. His clothes hung loose on his broad frame, worn out like the man himself, a living shadow of who he used to be. His hands were calloused, browned by sun and dirt, resting heavily on his knees like anchors. It had been 5 years since the fire. 5 years since screams filled these plains louder than coyotes ever could. 5 years since the night wind had blown through the cracks in the house and turned a fallen oil lamp into an inferno. 5 years since he'd buried his wife Sarah and their boy Jacob beneath the cottonwood trees on the hill behind the barn. The trees still stood, stubborn and dry as bones, but he hadn't climbed that hill since the day he planted the crosses. The days that followed were stitched together with barbed wire routines. Feed the cattle, mend the well, patch the roof, eat a can of beans. Drink until your memories blur and the silence doesn't cut so deep. Sleep when you can. Wake up and do it again. He had no visitors, no neighbors anymore. The last drifter who came looking for water got a rifle barrel pointed between his eyes. Thomas didn't care who they were. The land was cruel, and a man alone had to be crueler to survive it. That evening, the wind shifted. The sky had been still and bright for days, but now, black clouds rolled over the horizon like a cavalry charge. Lightning licked the sky in branching veins. The first distant roar of thunder made the windows of the ranch house tremble in their frames. Thomas didn't flinch. He just took another swig and leaned back into the wood, the creaking of the chair lost beneath the rising howl of the storm. The horses in the corral kicked and whinnied. The cattle lowed nervously. Animals always knew when something unnatural was coming. The storm broke just as the sun dipped behind the hills, turning the world blood red before plunging it into shadow. Rain came down like nails, pounding the tin roof with relentless fury. Thomas stood and walked to the barn to check the latch on the door, muttering to himself beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't bother with a lantern. The lightning lit up the plains in quick flashes of silver and bone. He made it to the barn, secured the door, and paused, peering into the dark edges of the structure. A shiver ran down his spine, but he told himself it was just the cold rain soaking through his duster. He turned and trudged back to the house, not knowing that behind the barn, in the mud and storm, lay something, or someone, who hadn't come with the wind. Morning arrived with a bitter chill. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the earth wet and sullen. Water pooled in the cattle troughs. Mud clung to every surface. The storm had left its mark. Thomas opened the door and stepped onto the porch, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The hangover hadn't fully left him, and his boots sank slightly into the wet ground as he walked toward the corral. He passed the barn and paused. There it was again. A sound, faint, like a metal clinking or something shifting against wood. He turned his head. There, behind the barn, just beyond the stacked crates and the old plow he hadn't used in years, was a shadow. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, barely, like something crawling or trying to sit up. Thomas moved cautiously, hand drifting to the revolver at his hip. As he rounded the barn, his breath caught. There, half buried in the mud, was a figure. Small, filthy, and broken. It was a girl. She was no more than 14 or 15. Skin, the color of rich earth, dark hair plastered to her cheeks with rain and blood. Her arms were stretched awkwardly behind her back, chained to an iron stake driven into the ground. The cuffs had torn into her wrists, leaving raw, red grooves. Her dress, if it could still be called that, was torn and clinging to her frail frame. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes were open but glazed. Thomas dropped to one knee. "Jesus," he whispered. She flinched. "It's all right," he said, unsure if she understood him. "I'm not going to hurt you." She coughed, a dry rattle that spoke of hours without water. Her mouth moved, but he had to lean in close to catch the words. "They sold me," she whispered, eyes flicking toward his face. "But I saw what they did." Then her body sagged, head lolling forward as she fainted. Thomas didn't move at first. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. The words rattled around his mind. Sold. Saw. Did. Who was she? Where had she come from? Who left her here? He looked around, but there were no tracks he could see. Just storm-washed mud and broken grass. He rose slowly, drawing a deep breath, and unhooked the clasp of his knife. The shackles were rusted and thick, but he pried them loose with patience and quiet cursing. The girl didn't stir. Once the chains were off, he lifted her into his arms. She was light, frighteningly so, like a bundle of sticks and bones wrapped in rags. Her skin was hot with fever. Thomas carried her into the barn first, laying her on a blanket of old hay. He fetched water from the well and soaked a cloth, pressing it to her forehead. Her lips twitched, but she didn't wake. He brought out an old cot from the back corner and laid her on it. For a moment he just stood there, staring at her, heart hammering with something unfamiliar. Something like fear, but not of danger. It was the fear of responsibility, of care, of being pulled out of the hole he dug for himself and forced to face something real. She wasn't his problem. She shouldn't be his problem. He could take her to town, drop her off at the sheriff's office, let them deal with it. Or he could ride away and pretend he never saw her. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But when he looked at her face, drawn, battered, innocent despite everything, he saw Jacob. He saw Sarah, and he knew he wasn't going to walk away. He brought her to the house before the sun climbed too high, setting her down on the cot in the corner of the main room. He lit a fire in the stove, boiled water, and shredded the last of his clean cloths into bandages. He worked in silence, hands steady, mind racing. Every so often she muttered in her sleep, soft, haunted sounds in a language he didn't understand. Outside, the land was waking up again. The cattle moved. The birds returned to their perch on the fence line. But inside the house, something else had awakened. Something Thomas had buried with 2 handmade crosses years ago. He sat beside her as the fire crackled, eyes fixed on the girl who had fallen out of the storm and into his life. Her words echoed in his mind. "They sold me, but I saw what they did." And suddenly, the silence he had once cherished felt heavier than ever. The sky was pale and streaked with pink when Thomas stepped out of the house again. The girl lay silent on the cot behind him, barely breathing. Her fever hadn't broken, and though he had given her sips of water throughout the night, she hadn't stirred since she'd spoken those strange, haunting words. "They sold me, but I saw what they did." They echoed louder with every hour. He leaned against the porch post and lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl upward like a prayer without a god. The cattle were restless again. Their low, guttural moans rose from the far field, mingling with the buzz of early flies and the distant trill of meadowlarks. The ranch felt changed, like it had drawn in a breath and was holding it, waiting to exhale. Thomas didn't like it. He spent the morning riding the fence line, checking for breaks. The storm had downed a post near the eastern ridge, but he left it. The girl needed watching. On the ride back, the land whispered to him again, shifting winds, strange stillness, an unease that gripped the base of his spine. He wasn't a man prone to fear, but something about the girl's sudden appearance, her condition, and those words had made the air thick with questions. When he opened the cabin door again, her eyes were open, dark, rimmed with shadows, alert like a deer watching the tree line. She didn't speak, just followed his movements as he crossed to the stove, poured water into a tin cup, and offered it to her. She didn't take it. "You thirsty?" he asked. No answer. Her gaze never left him. Not defiant, not frightened, just unreadable, like the eyes of a thing too wild for language. He set the cup on the stool beside her cot. "I ain't gonna hurt you. I already unshackled you, didn't I?" Her fingers twitched, but she said nothing. Thomas eased back into the rocker near the fireplace, rubbing the back of his neck. The silence stretched until it snapped. "What's your name?" Still nothing. The fire popped. "I gotta call you something," he muttered. She blinked, once, then twice. Her lips parted, dry and chapped. "Nayeli!" It was barely a whisper. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. "Nayeli," he repeated. "That your name?" A faint nod. He let the silence return for a moment, then asked, "You remember where you came from?" Another pause. Her eyes dropped to her wrists, still raw, still scabbed. Her hand crept toward the tin cup, and with trembling fingers, she lifted it to her lips. She drank slowly, like she was afraid it might disappear. Thomas waited. When she lowered the cup, she looked at him, this time not with suspicion, but with the quiet of someone too used to being ignored. "They took me from the river bend. I was looking for berries," she said slowly. "White men, soldiers maybe, not from a fort." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "When?" 3, 4 sunsets," her voice rasped. "They tied me. They said they would trade me. But I saw them, the boy. They killed him. White boy, shot in the back. They laughed." Thomas felt a cold shiver worm its way down his back. "They said it was a message, for settlers. Blamed the Apache. But it was not us. I saw the tattoo, a snake, on his neck." Her eyes darted to his face, gauging his reaction. Snake. It meant nothing to Thomas, yet, but the clarity in her voice chilled him. She wasn't rambling. This wasn't fever talk. She remembered, every detail etched into her memory like brands into cattle. "You got a family?" he asked. She nodded once. "My father was chief. My brothers hunt. I don't know if they look for me. They might think I'm dead." Thomas leaned back again, mind racing. The town was a half-day's ride. Sheriff Murdoch wouldn't take kindly to this story, especially not from a native girl who'd witnessed the murder of a settler boy. There'd been a recent killing. Thomas remembered hearing it last time he was in town, weeks ago. The boy's body had been found near the creek, shot in the back. Blame had gone straight to the Apache. Of course it had. No one questioned it. And now, this girl, this child. She sipped again from the tin cup, her hands steadier now. Her eyes were watching the fire, and in their reflection, Thomas saw the embers of something old, something sacred and dangerous, like a forgotten truth clawing its way to the surface. That night, she slept in the cabin again. Thomas lay down on a bedroll near the door, rifle propped beside him. He didn't sleep. Not really. Dreams came in short bursts. A house on fire. A boy's scream. Chains in the mud. Then, eyes. Nayeli's eyes. Deep and ancient. By morning, she was stronger. She asked for food, which he gave her. Eggs, hard biscuits, jerky. She ate with the quiet, mechanical focus of someone who had been denied for too long. When she finished, she looked up at him. "There is something." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, they kept a book. The man with the hat. He wrote names. Trades. Places. Said it was their map." "What kind of book?" "Brown, leather. He kept it in his coat. But when they beat me, they forgot. I hid it under my dress." Thomas blinked. "You saying you still got it?" She nodded. "I didn't let go." He crossed to her cot. She shifted, sat up slowly, reached beneath the cot's ragged blanket. From a tear in the lining of her dress, she pulled out a small, weather-worn book. She held it out with both hands. Thomas took it gently. It was water-damaged, but still intact. Pages filled with scribbled names, notes, crude drawings of trails, landmarks. One page was marked with a coiled snake drawn in ink beside a list of first names, men's names. Another had dates, some crossed out, some circled. Some had words beside them: delivered, paid, disposed. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. He shut the book, hard. "You sure this is real?" "I saw them write in it." He stared at her, then nodded slowly. He slipped the book into a box beneath the floorboards, where he kept his old war medals and a photograph of Sarah and Jacob. He'd never expected to add anything to that box, and certainly not something like this. The day passed quietly. Thomas stayed near the house. Nayeli helped him stir stew by the fire. She didn't smile, didn't laugh, but her eyes were more alive than they'd been before. At dusk, she sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the wind dance through the grass. Thomas sat beside her, bottle untouched for once. "I didn't think I'd wake up," she said. He looked over. "Neither did I." They sat in silence, side by side, two broken pieces, trying to understand their fit in the wide, cruel puzzle of the West. Later that night, as coyotes howled at the moon and owls hunted in the trees, Thomas stood by the barn, staring out into the distance. Something was coming. He could feel it. The girl had brought more than just a story. She had brought danger. Truth. And in a town like theirs, truth could get a man killed. But still, he'd chosen to bring her in. Still, he'd given her food, water, safety. Still, he'd listened. Because she was a child. Because she had suffered. Because he was tired of doing nothing. He looked back at the house, where her shadow moved behind the window. Then, he looked up at the sky. The stars were bright again. No storm in sight. But Thomas knew better. The storm had already come. And it wasn't done with him yet. Thomas didn't sleep that night. The wind outside carried a sound he hadn't heard in years. Not a howl, not a whistle, but a low, crawling whisper. It slid between the cracks of the wooden cabin like a snake slithering through dead leaves. It pressed against the windows, creaked beneath the floorboards, wrapped itself around the edges of his memory like smoke curling from the black mouth of that fire long ago. Something old was stirring. Not in the land, not in the trees, but inside him. He sat at the table, the small brown journal open under the flickering lantern light. Nayeli had gone to sleep an hour before, curled in a blanket beside the hearth, her breathing steady now. Her fever had broken. Her strength was slowly returning. But the words she spoke and the journal she carried had infected the silence of the ranch like a sickness. Thomas flipped another page. More names. Some marked with crude X's. Others labeled paid in lead. Trails mapped out with red ink. Rivers and canyons circled. At the bottom of one page, beneath the word Canyon Red Gap, was a symbol, an S with fangs. A snake, drawn in haste. The same one Nayeli mentioned. He didn't recognize most of the names, but one stood out. Bold letters. Cliff Murdoch. His eyes narrowed. That name. The sheriff's brother. Thought to be dead. Buried in a box 3 years ago after a shootout gone wrong. Or so the town believed. There were rumors, though. Whispers of bounty hunters operating under the law's blind eye. Whispers of vigilantes. Thomas had heard it in the saloon once. A passing comment, silenced by a bark of laughter and a drink, slammed down too hard. But now here it was, in writing, tied to the trafficking of children. He closed the journal. Outside, the moon cast a pale glow across the plains. It turned the ranch into a sheet of bone and silver. Every shadow stretched long and thin like limbs of the dead. Thomas stepped out, rifle slung across his shoulder. He scanned the tree line, then the barn. He didn't expect anyone, not yet. But if even a breath of this truth reached the wrong ears, they would come. And they wouldn't knock. The next morning, Nayeli woke before dawn. She moved more easily now, legs no longer trembling when she stood. Thomas found her near the water trough, washing her hands in the freezing water, her eyes on the horizon. She looked like a ghost returned to the land she'd been ripped from. He brought her bread and dried apple slices. She nodded her thanks, then sat cross-legged in the grass. "You said Cliff Murdoch had the snake tattoo?" he asked her. She didn't look up. "Yes, left side, behind his ear." Thomas nodded. "You know who he is?" She shook her head. "They didn't call names, but I heard others talk. He gave orders. He laughed when the boy died. Said no one would question an Indian raid. You saw them kill him?" She met his eyes. "I saw everything." Thomas felt the breath leave his lungs. If she was right, and everything in him screamed she was, then the boy found at Red Creek wasn't killed by Apaches. He was murdered to stir rage, to provoke war. And Sheriff Murdoch had called it a tribal act of aggression. "Why leave you alive?" he asked. "They plan to sell me, or keep me." Her voice caught. Thomas didn't press. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud. He stood and walked back toward the house. The journal still sat beneath the floorboards, heavy as stone in his thoughts. If the town knew what he held, if Murdoch even suspected, they'd come with guns and rope, not questions. By midday, Thomas saddled his horse and told Nayeli to stay inside. She didn't argue. He rode into town with the journal hidden beneath his coat, his revolver cleaned and loaded. The dirt road into Broken Hollow hadn't changed. Still dry, still narrow, lined with warped posts and swinging signs. But every glance now felt longer. Every eye on him made the muscles in his shoulders tense. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped into the cool shade. A few men stood at the counter, quieting when he entered. Mr. Grady, the storekeeper, gave him a slow nod. Thomas bought coffee, salt, flour, enough to make the ride look honest. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Murdoch would hear he'd come into town. That was the point. As Thomas turned to leave, a man stepped through the door. Sheriff Blake Murdoch. Tall, lean, with a long mustache and a cold, practiced stare. His badge glinted on his chest like a warning. "Tom," the sheriff said smoothly, "heard you rode in. Thought you gave up on town life." "Just need supplies," Thomas replied. "That right?" Murdoch tilted his head. "Or maybe you've got company back at the ranch?" Thomas didn't blink. "Just the wind and the coyotes." The sheriff smiled, but his eyes didn't. "Funny thing. One of the Wilson boys was out near your ridge 2 days ago. Swore he saw someone behind your barn, thought it strange." Thomas stepped forward, close enough that their boots nearly touched. "You spying on me now, Murdoch?" "Just keeping my county safe." "From who?" Murdoch leaned closer, voice low. "You're not the only one who's seen strange things out there. Red Creek. Blood on the rocks. A boy gone cold. This land's full of killers, Tom. Some of 'em got dark skin. Some of 'em wear your face." Thomas's hand twitched near his coat, but he held still. "That's funny. I was just thinking the same thing." Murdoch's smile dropped. "You got something to say it." Thomas said nothing, just turned and walked out, feeling the weight of the sheriff's stare between his shoulder blades. By the time he reached home, the sun was sliding behind the hills. Nayeli met him at the porch. "They will come," she said. He nodded. "I know." He opened the journal and turned to the page with Cliff Murdoch's name. Below it, a date was scrawled. 5 days from now. Beside it, Laramie Bend. Trade confirmed. Another child? Another lie? Thomas slammed the book shut. "We're not waiting," he said. That night, under the cover of darkness, he loaded supplies into his saddlebag. He told Nayeli to dress warm. They were riding east. Not to Laramie Bend, but close enough to watch, to see who showed up. If they could prove what was happening, maybe even catch Murdoch's men in the act, it would change everything. But it was dangerous. Suicidal, maybe. Thomas knew it. Nayeli knew it too. But she said nothing. She just climbed onto the horse behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. They rode, through the black hills, across riverbeds, through canyons that whispered secrets. The stars above burned bright, silent witnesses to old crimes and new vengeance. They camped by a small ridge, 3 miles from the bend. From there they waited. On the second night, they saw them. 5 riders, 1 wagon, lanterns glowing like fireflies in the dark. Thomas peered through his scope. Men with rifles. Another man in a long coat. A snake tattoo visible even from this distance, curling down from behind his ear. Cliff Murdoch. Alive. Thomas's heart slammed against his ribs. Another man stepped from the wagon. Sheriff Murdoch. They spoke, exchanged something, then pulled a small figure from the back of the wagon. A child. Tied. Crying. Nayeli's breath caught. Thomas raised his rifle, finger on the trigger. "Wait," Nayeli whispered. "We need proof. Let them trade." Thomas's hands trembled. And then a third party arrived, another group of riders, unknown to either side. Guns were drawn. A standoff erupted. Chaos, gunshots, horses screamed. The child escaped, running into the brush. Thomas and Nayeli watched, breathless as Cliff Murdoch was shot through the chest. Sheriff Murdoch fled into the shadows. When the gunfire stopped, only bodies remained. Thomas stood slowly, shoulders heavy. "We go now," he said. Nayeli nodded. They descended the ridge, found the child. A boy no older than 10, sobbing in fear. Nayeli calmed him, wrapped him in a blanket. Thomas searched the bodies, found papers, names, roots, letters with signatures. One with Murdoch's seal. The truth, in ink and blood. They returned to the ranch 2 nights later, the boy asleep in the back room, Nayeli resting in the rocker. Thomas sat by the fire, the papers spread before him. The storm was no longer coming, it was already here, and next time, he wouldn't be alone. The days that followed felt like the slow winding of a noose. The air around the ranch was tighter, stiffer, like the land itself had learned to hold its breath. Thomas moved through each hour with a weight in his chest, like the sky might collapse if he blinked too long. He'd hidden the documents deep under the floorboards, letters bearing Sheriff Murdoch's mark, transaction notes from the trade at Laramie Bend, and the blood-stained map found on Cliff Murdoch's body. It was enough to bury a man's legacy. It was enough to get them all killed. The boy they'd rescued didn't talk much. His name was Eli. His hands trembled when he ate. His eyes darted to corners even in broad daylight. He hadn't spoken a full sentence since the night they found him. Nayeli sat with him most mornings, slicing apples and whispering stories in her native tongue, soft and rhythmic like a lullaby born of the wind. She never forced him to respond. She just stayed beside him, a living promise that he wasn't alone anymore. Thomas watched them from the porch, rifle always within reach. He knew time was short. Murdoch had returned to town with blood on his boots and questions on his tail, and Thomas knew the sheriff would guess where the missing child had gone. There weren't many places to hide in the valley, even fewer that would take in a native girl and a white boy, both marked by the same crime. The storm hit the ranch 3 nights later, not the kind that came from the sky, but the kind that rode on boots and horses and the cold certainty of violence. It started with hoofbeats, distant at first, like a thunder rumble beneath the earth, then louder. 10 riders at least, maybe 12. Lanterns bobbing in the night, torches casting twitching shadows against the trees. Thomas blew out every lamp in the house. He moved fast, quiet, pulled Nayeli and Eli to the root cellar beneath the floorboards, and told them not to make a sound. He slid the trapdoor shut just as the first shout echoed from the field. "Rourke, we know you're in there!" Voices, boots crunching on gravel. Thomas knelt beside the fireplace, the cold iron of his rifle pressed to his cheek. Moonlight painted long bars through the slats of the boarded windows. The front door shook as a heavy fist struck it once, twice. "You got something don't belong to you, Tom." Sheriff Murdoch. His voice was calm, casual, a serpent sunning itself on a stone. Thomas said nothing. "I don't want trouble. Hell, I never wanted this. But you're sheltering a known criminal now. That Apache girl's a fugitive. Murdered a settler boy. Took a child hostage. There's a price on her head. We're just here to collect what's owed." Still, Thomas didn't move. A pause. "You got 10 seconds." The rifle was warm now in Thomas's grip. His blood surged like fire through his arms. 10 seconds stretched into forever. Then, silence. Then, a shot. The door exploded inward, splinters flying. Thomas rolled to the side, fired once, then again. 2 men went down in the doorway, one screaming as he clutched his shoulder, the other limp like a dropped sack of grain. The others scattered, ducking behind fence posts and barrels. Gunfire lit up the night like fireflies. Thomas reloaded, breath ragged. He could hear them shouting, cursing, calling for fire. Then, a flicker of orange through the window. Smoke. They'd set the barn alight. The flames caught fast, dry wood crackling and hissing as the fire licked its way up the walls. The heat hit the side of the house like a slap. Eli cried out from the cellar. Thomas fired again, reloading without thought, without fear. Just action. The way he used to in the war. The way he had the night he pulled his family from the fire, only to lose them to smoke and time. And now it was happening again. He saw movement at the back of the house, 2 men circling. He dropped one with a clean shot to the chest. The other ducked, scrambled out of sight. More bullets hit the cabin walls. One shattered the window near his head. Glass flew, slicing his cheek. He barely noticed. Then the front went quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something worse was coming. Then he heard it. The thud of boots on the porch. And Murdoch's voice, close now, cold and venomous. "You really want to die for her, Rourke?" Thomas stood slowly. "I want to see you burn," he said, and pulled the trigger. The sheriff ducked as the bullet whistled past his ear and buried itself in the frame. Return fire tore through the doorway. Thomas dove behind the stove. His shoulder screamed as a splinter gouged his skin. Below the floorboards, Nayeli clutched Eli close. They heard the shouting. The gunfire, the roaring barn. Nayeli crawled to the edge of the trap door. She pressed her ear to the wood. Then she heard something else. Footsteps. Behind the house. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the trap door open, pulled herself into the dark kitchen, grabbed the small revolver Thomas had left hidden in the drawer. Her feet were bare. Her hands steady. Outside, Murdoch kicked in the door, stepping into the smoke and flickering light. Thomas aimed, but not fast enough. Murdoch fired first. The bullet slammed into Thomas's side, knocking him back into the wall. He grunted, dropped to one knee, still trying to raise the rifle. "Should have stayed dead with your family," Murdoch said, stepping closer. Then a crack split the air. Murdoch froze. Blood bloomed from his leg. He looked down, shocked, as another shot rang out, this one slicing through his arm. He dropped his pistol with a snarl. Behind him, Nayeli stood in the doorway, the revolver trembling in her grip. Murdoch turned, furious. "You little—" Thomas fired. Murdoch jerked backward, eyes wide, mouth open, but no sound coming. He collapsed to the floor like a dropped marionette. Blood pooled around him. His hand twitched. Then nothing. Silence returned. Not the silence of fear, but of ending. Thomas groaned, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. Nayeli rushed to him. "You're hit," she whispered. He nodded. "Not bad." She helped him sit. The barn was gone. Just a black skeleton glowing with embers. But the house still stood. And they were still breathing. Eli climbed out of the cellar, eyes wide, face streaked with soot. Thomas looked at them both, then laughed, low and broken. "I told you they'd come," he said. Nayeli didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. Instead, she stepped outside, walked to Murdoch's body, and stood over it. Her face was unreadable. After a long moment, she looked up at the sky. The wind had changed. And for the first time in years, the ranch felt clean. Ash still hung in the air when the sun rose over the blackened ribs of the barn. Smoke drifted lazily, curling around the broken posts and splintered fences like fog over a battlefield. The silence was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence that comes after a storm, when everything that once screamed has finally gone still. Thomas leaned against the porch beam, a fresh bandage wrapped tight around his side, pain blooming beneath the linen with every breath. He watched the smoke rise from what used to be his barn, what used to be the last piece of his family's past, and didn't feel sorrow, not the kind that made a man cry, just the kind that reminded him he was still alive. Nayeli sat on the steps, knees drawn to her chest, her eyes tracing the horizon. She hadn't said much since the night Murdoch died. The blood, the fire, the gunshots, they had soaked deep into her. Not in a way that broke her, but in a way that changed the shape of her silence. She was no longer just a survivor. She had become something else. Eli was asleep inside, curled into the corner of the couch with a quilt pulled to his chin. The boy had cried after the fight. Not at first, but after. When the gunfire had stopped and Thomas had whispered that it was over, the boy had collapsed into Nayeli's arms and sobbed until his chest heaved and his eyes swelled. It hadn't been loud, just desperate, like a sound that had waited too long to be let out. Thomas looked down at Nayeli. "You ever seen death before that night?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, without turning, she said, "Yes, but not like that." He nodded, letting her be. She wasn't the kind of girl who needed her wounds wrapped in words. They spent the next 3 days tending to the aftermath. Thomas buried the men who'd attacked the house. He didn't bother carving their names into the crosses. He just marked the graves and left them near the far hill where the weeds grew thick and the coyotes didn't come. He wrapped Murdoch's body in canvas and rode it into town in the back of a wagon. "Sheriff's dead," he told the deputy. "Tried to burn my place down. Tried to kill me." The deputy didn't ask questions. He just stared at the body, then at the papers Thomas handed him. Documents covered in blood and truth. Names, trades, signatures. Thomas didn't stay. He didn't need to. He knew the town would read those papers. Knew the law would come riding from far-off cities with clean coats and cold eyes. Knew the town would break into whispers and gossip and regret. He didn't care. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He just wanted to breathe without tasting ashes. When he got back to the ranch, Nayeli was waiting with a brush in one hand and a plank of barnwood in the other. "What's this?" he asked, lowering himself onto the porch steps. She didn't answer, just dipped the brush into a small pot of black paint she'd mixed from ash and leftover oil. She painted a bird. Its wings spread wide, feathers tattered and wild. Chains dangled from its legs, broken and curling like vines, but its beak was open in song, and its eyes burned with light. The sky behind it was streaked in gold, not red. Thomas watched her in silence. When she finished, she stood the plank up against the barn ruins. "It's free now," she said. Thomas looked from the bird to her. "So are you." She met his gaze, unflinching. "So are you." The words hit him harder than any bullet. Because she wasn't wrong. He'd spent 5 years building walls around grief, letting silence become his prayer and pain become his religion. But she had cracked through it with nothing but truth and presence. He nodded. Once. Later that evening, they lit a new fire in the pit behind the house. Not for warmth, but for food. Nayeli had caught a rabbit. Eli had chopped kindling. Thomas carved new planks to repair the chicken coop. For the first time in years, the land around him felt like something living, like something worth tending. Eli sat close to the fire, watching the meat sizzle on the spit. Thomas poured coffee into 3 tin cups and handed one to Nayeli. "You think you'll ever want to go back?" he asked. She turned the cup in her hands. "I don't know where back is." Thomas waited. "My people are scattered. My father may be dead. My brothers, if they searched, they haven't found me, and I've changed." "You can stay here," Thomas said. "Ain't much, but it's yours too." She looked at him. "You sure?" He nodded. "You saved my life. You gave that boy a chance to breathe again. This place is yours if you want it." Nayeli didn't cry. but something flickered in her eyes. A release, maybe. Or gratitude, too deep for words. She sipped her coffee. "I'll stay," she said softly. The next morning, Thomas saddled the old mare and rode east, toward the trading post. He needed lumber, nails, tools, supplies for rebuilding. The ranch was scarred, but it wasn't dead, and neither was he. The ride was long, the sun hot against his back, but he felt lighter somehow, like a stone had been removed from his chest. The townsfolk gave him strange looks when he passed. Half respect, half fear. Word had traveled fast. Some looked away. Others nodded solemnly. No one spoke. He liked it that way. By the time he returned, the coop was mended, the trough refilled, and Nayeli was drawing again, this time on a strip of canvas Thomas found in the attic. The bird was back, but now it flew above a hill with 3 silhouettes beneath it. One tall, one small, one standing slightly apart. It made his throat tighten. He didn't say anything, just watched. They spent the next weeks building, mending, replanting, living. Eli began to talk. First in pieces, then full thoughts. He asked about the horses. He asked about the stars. He asked if it was okay to call Thomas Pa. Thomas hadn't answered at first. But the next morning, he made the boy his eggs just the way Jacob used to like them. And when Eli called him Pa again, he simply said, "All right." Nayeli painted the barn doors. When she finished, she stood back and let Thomas take it in. The image was bold. A ranch house under a clear sky, 3 figures at its door. Behind them, a fire burning, but they were walking away from it. "It's not what burned," she said. "It's what stayed." Thomas couldn't speak. The government men came 2 months later, suits, polished boots. They asked questions, took notes, promised justice, promised changes. Thomas didn't care if they meant it. The documents were in their hands now. The names, the trades, the rot. They couldn't unsee it. Before they left, one of them shook Thomas's hand. "You did the right thing," he said. Thomas didn't answer. He was already thinking about the fence near the North Ridge, about the spring hay, about the hammer waiting on the porch. That night, the 3 of them sat by the fire again. Eli dozed with his head on Nayeli's shoulder. She hummed a song Thomas didn't know, soft and low, her voice steady. Thomas leaned back, letting the crackle of flame wash over him. He remembered the first time he'd seen her, broken, chained, filthy behind the barn. He remembered her words. "They sold me. But I saw what they did, and now she was here, whole, fierce, free. So was he." And as the stars blinked open in the velvet sky above, Thomas whispered to the wind, "Thank you." In the heart of a land shaped by dust, fire, and silence, 3 souls found something far more powerful than vengeance or survival. They found family. What began as a lonely rancher's burden became the rebirth of a home, and the healing of wounds deeper than bullets could reach. Amid the ashes of cruelty and betrayal, love, trust, and resilience rose like a wild bird finally unchained. In the end, the West didn't tame them. They rewrote its story. If this story stirred your heart and left you craving more tales of courage, redemption, and unexpected love on the frontier, then don't ride off just yet. Hit that subscribe button and join us here on Wild West Love Chronicles, where the most powerful battles are fought not with guns, but with loyalty, honor, and the strength to protect the ones we love. Saddle up and stay with us. The next legend is just around the bend.